Thank you for joining today's Grand Challenges of Our Time, the first Presidential Distinguished Forum. This is the first in a series of discussions featuring renowned experts working at the forefront of today's most pressing issues, from the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change to voter access and the social unrest that has led to the Black Lives Movement. Current and national and world events present unprecedented challenges, but also provide a meaningful chance to investigate today's issues together and explore new and better paths forward. Collectively, these discussions are part of the Grand Challenges of Our Time course for first-year students that our very own President Pines is teaching this fall. It is the first class taught by a UMD president in more than 20 years and is designed so that students can examine the most pressing issues of our time in their historical and current contexts and to share their own perspectives and stories in the hopes of affecting change. My name is Brian Ullman. I'm the Associate Vice President for Marketing Communications, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Today, we are very pleased to be joined by Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, the incredible scientist whose research exposed the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. To introduce her more fully, I turn it over to President Darryll Pines.
Good afternoon, University of Maryland, and to UNIV 110. Please join me in virtually welcoming Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, the physician, scientist, and public health activist who shined a national spotlight on the Flint, Michigan water crisis through her research, revealing children have been exposed to dangerous levels of lead. She is now the director of an initiative to mitigate the impact of this crisis. In her book, What the Eyes Don't See, Dr. Hanna-Attisha shares her inspiring personal story about speaking truth to power. So let's set the stage for what you're about to hear. Dr. Mona, I was struck by the fact that you cite in your book, a kid born in Flint, Michigan will live 15 years less than a kid born in a neighboring suburb. Please tell us about Flint, Michigan.
I would love to, but first, it's great to be here. It's great to be with all of you. Thank you, President Pines, for the invitation. And thank you for your leadership to engage our future leaders with some of our grand challenges. So I commend you and I commend the university. So Flint, so maybe we can even kind of make this a little bit of a discussion. So if you guys have access to the chat, tell me what Flint was famous for. Do you guys know what Flint was famous for like a long time ago before the water crisis? Flint was famous for something really amazing that we all kind of can't live without right now. And I think it's, oh, there it is, Kelsey, good job. So the auto industry, automobiles, you guys got it. So Flint was famous for cars. We were the birthplace of automobiles. And even kind of more importantly than being the birthplace of manufacturing, there's something else that Flint is famous for that really changed the course of so many working people in the country. So, oh, somebody wrote Michael Moore. We'll get to Michael Moore. So what else do you guys know that Flint was famous for? Unions. Oh my God, you guys are amazing. Joseph wins, he gets extra credit. So shortly after cars were being made, the workers in Flint, Michigan, the auto workers said, hey, wait a minute, like this corporation, General Motors, is making a lot of money and we're not getting a fair share of that prosperity. We don't have anything like benefits or occupational safety and health. I mean, when we make blue cars, we're coughing up blue that day. So the workers in Flint did something totally illegal and totally radical and totally disobedient. And they sat down in the car plants and they did something called the sit-down strikes. And this was known as a strike that was heard around the world. For 44 days, they literally sat down and demanded a lot of the things that we take for granted right now as employees. And they won. Their union was recognized and born, and that was the UAW. And what came about was something called the Grand Bargain, which informed wages across the country for decades because of the resistance of auto workers in Flint. And people all over America came to Flint for prosperity, especially African Americans in the Great Migration North, fleeing the oppression of Jim Crow, came to places like Flint and many of kind of northern cities for more opportunity, not necessarily equality, but more opportunity. And also immigrants all over the world came to Flint for really that for jobs, great living wage jobs with benefits, healthcare, housing, great infrastructure, schools, and the list goes on. And then we get to the Michael Moore part. So then the history that followed after that kind of rise of the auto industry, the not only being the birthplace of cars, but really the birthplace of the middle class. The Flint is attributed with being the birthplace of the middle class. But then Flint is also became a story like in many of our post-manufacturing cities where an industry abandoned its birthplace, where where decisions were driven by greed and by racism and by neglect. So the people who had the power and the privilege to leave the city left the city, also known as kind of white flight. There was a lot of kind of racist real estate and housing practices and other lack of regionalization issues that created a city that was very segregated and very poor. Plants closed and jobs were lost, and Flint was in a state of crisis for decades before our water crisis. And so much so, like you mentioned, President Pines, that it impacts how long a child lives by their environment, by the conditions, the circumstances, by, if they have a safe neighborhood, if they have access to healthy nutrition, if there's great schools. All of these things are critical ingredients that as a pediatrician, we know makes kids healthy. And those ingredients were not there for a long time for Flint children. And as such, the zip code of a kid in Flint, just like in many of our communities, literally predicted where they ended up.
Wow, that's amazing. Tell us a little bit more about what actually happened in Flint and how did you get involved?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So I've been a pediatrician in Flint. I'm a medical educator with Michigan State University, and I've been caring for patients, and I still do care for patients. I was in clinic all day yesterday, taking care of little babies and checking their heart and lungs and their growth and all that fun stuff, give them shots, giving them flu shot. Everybody get your flu shot. It's really important this year. I was practicing as a pediatrician for about a year and a half, and my patients would come in with concerns about the drinking water. And I was very much kind of with lots of doctor confidence, with my long white coat, reassuring that my patients that everything was okay. And people were concerned because we had changed our water source in Flint. So because we had been in crisis for a long time, like Flint became at a point of being in near bankruptcy. And in Michigan, there was a rule that if you were almost bankrupt, the state can come in and take over. So Flint lost democracy. So it's also very much a democracy story. And we were under something called an emergency manager, and their job was to save money. And they decided that it was too expensive for us to get water from the Great Lakes. And I know there's some Michiganders out there. So for all the Michiganders out there, we're the Mitten State, okay? So we're surrounded by the Great Lakes, which is the largest source of fresh water in the world. And here's Flint. Here's Detroit, here's Flint, here's Ann Arbor, Grand Rapids. Anyways, here's Flint. And for half a century, we were getting our water from Lake Huron. We were buying it from Detroit. And the emergency managers decided, hey, that's too expensive for this predominantly poor, predominantly minority community. And we're going to save money by changing the water source. So in April of 2014, these unelected, unaccountable emergency managers decided to change our water source. And right away, there was problems. Like, do you guys remember those pictures of like brownish, yellowish color coming out of people's taps? So there was color odors and issue concerns or color and taste and odor and bacteria in our water. And we had boil advisories, lots of red flags for this water. But after every red flag, the authorities, the scientists, the experts, the people in charge were saying everything was okay, that people should literally relax, that everything was in compliance. And my jaw still drops when I share this story. We talked about General Motors being born in Flint, and General Motors still has some plants in Flint. And just a few months after our water switch, the General Motors plant that makes engine parts noticed that our drinking water was corroding those engine parts. Like, can you believe that? Our drinking water was corroding car parts. And General Motors was allowed to go back to Great Lakes water. Yet the people of Flint, once again, were told to relax. They were being dismissed and denied. This predominantly poor minority community was being silenced. So I got involved in the story when I heard about the possibility of lead being in the water. Our water was so corrosive, this untreated Flint water. It wasn't being treated with the right ingredient. For me, as a doctor, I think of it like a medicine that you're supposed to put in water treatment to prevent the pipes from corroding. And without that medicine, our water was about 20 times more corrosive.
Wow.
It ate up the lead that was in our plumbing. That lead came out of our plumbing into our drinking water and into the bodies of our children. And when I heard about the possibility of lead in the water, that's when I got involved. That's when my life changed, because I respect kind of the science of what lead does.
Wow, that's amazing. So as a medical physician and pediatrician, tell us what happens when a human being has lead in their bloodstream?
Yeah, that's a great question. So lead is probably the oldest and probably most well-studied neurotoxins known to man. We've known about the badness for lead really for centuries. So all of you out there, all those students, so what's the elemental symbol for lead? Do you guys remember from chemistry? What do we call lead? Okay, President Pines. Okay, so everybody knows. Okay, so PB. So you guys got it. So PB is Latin for plumbum, which means plumbing. So lead actually means plumbing, and I didn't even know this before I got involved in the story. And I didn't even know that there was lead kind of, throughout our water distribution system. If anybody's been to like Pompeii, Italy, you can see the perfectly preserved lead pipes, in this Roman city. And there's actually strong theories that hypothesize the demise of the Romans was because they used lead in their plumbing, but they also put lead in their food, which is totally not a good idea. So we've known that lead is bad for centuries. Yet industry was super powerful. The lead industry was super powerful, and when the rest of the world was limiting the use of lead because they recognized it was a poison, that's when a lot of American industries started to put it in things. We put it in paint, we put it in gasoline, we put it in plumbing, and the lead industry was so powerful that they limited regulations. They limited kind of the restrictions of the use of lead in all of these industries, and they instilled doubt in the science, and also attacked scientists and parents who were sharing their concerns about lead. So what we've learned, especially over the last few decades, is that there's no safe level of lead at all. Levels we thought were okay decades ago, even when I was a medical student, we now know are not okay. And that's because it attacks especially a developing child's nervous system. It causes things like cognition problems. So it actually decreases IQ levels. It causes behavioral problems, leads to things like attention problems, focusing problems, causes growth disorders, developmental delays. The list goes on and on and on. And even kids exposed as young children, you don't see the consequences to later on in life, which is why in pediatrics we call it a silent pediatric epidemic. We don't see lead poisoning right away, but we see the consequences later. Even as in adulthood, a child exposed to lead as a young person can manifest as an older person with things like high blood pressure and gout and early dementia. So because of this incredible science, especially over the last 30 years, we now respect that there's no safe level. And what we're supposed to do in public health is this concept of primary prevention, which means we're never supposed to expose a population to something like lead because of what it can do to especially our children.
So once you had this evidence of elevated lead levels in the water, you scheduled a meeting with the mayor. How did that meeting go?
That's a great question. So I, when I heard about the possibility of lead in the water, so I quickly did the science, did the research to see if that lead was in our children. And I was hoping that I wasn't going to find out, that there was more lead in our kids, but it was bound to be there. There was lead in our water in the hundreds and thousands of parts per billion. And yes, my science showed that yes, there was more lead in our children. So I was pressing every button to get to get folks to pay attention to this crisis. And doors were closing in every direction. People did not want to hear this. I was being silenced and dismissed, and folks didn't want to believe and literally turned their eyes away from what was happening to our Flint children. So I shared this research with the mayor, and part of me is like, I'm sharing science and facts. Like, can you imagine being in the middle of a public health crisis and not listening to science and public health experts and the medical community? So President Pines is laughing. We find ourselves in a very similar situation today. So I was naive. I'm like, oh my gosh, like how can somebody dispute science? Like how can somebody dispute this clear data that shows, there's more lead in the children's blood and that nothing else is happening, outside of the water limits. So I didn't get the reaction that I wanted. The folks in charge continued to doubt that there was a problem and failed at the most fundamental, rule for children, which is kind of prevention.
Right. So you had all this data, you had charts and graphs, but how did you actually convey your point to these leaders of the city?
Oh, that's a wonderful, I'm so glad you asked me that. And that's something that I have absolutely learned through this experience as an academic, as a scientist, as a doctor, that, we can communicate with graphs and statistics and p-values, and that's all important. We all need to know how to do kind of fundamental research and interpret science and data. But sometimes we need lots of different tools and skills to persuade folks. And ultimately, I was able to really change the narrative and fundamentally change the trajectory of a city by sharing more than just science. The science was a key part of it, but so were the stories. And as a doctor, every single patient encounter I have is a story. It's a chance to share the experience and really the promise of our children with other folks. And when I started to begin to share their stories, when I used their names, obviously changed to protect confidentiality, when I began to for example, hold up a baby bottle at a press conference, the media began to pay attention, policymakers began to pay attention, and we were finally able to change the narrative.
Wow, so you had to use a baby bottle to get your point across. Amazing. So you were told during this time period to be careful with coming forward with this data and with this evidence. So I'm really interested in how that made you feel, but also in your book, as much about that, it's about this concept that you mentioned called ED. You were actually dismissed by some as a mere local pediatrician, weren't you? So tell us about how this made you feel, and tell us a little bit more about this concept of ED.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, when I went public, which is with my research that our kids were in harm's way, I was kind of dismissed. I was attacked. The state said I was an unfortunate researcher, that I was splicing, dicing numbers, and that I was causing near hysteria, which is sexist and has been leveled against many women, who are trying to speak truth to power. So, it was very hard. I was kind of trying to prepare myself as a whistleblower. I knew there'd be intimidation. I knew there would be retaliation, but nothing can really prepare you when the state and every arm of the state tells you you're wrong. And then I began to second guess myself. I'm like, oh my gosh, maybe I am wrong. And I developed this kind of sense of imposter syndrome. Like, oh my gosh, maybe it wasn't my job. Maybe somebody else should have spoken up. Like, maybe I really don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe my science is wrong. And fortunately, and very quickly, I began to realize that, hey, this has nothing to do with me. Like, they can come after me all they want. It's not about me. And it's really about my children. So as a pediatrician, like, I've literally taken an oath to protect kids. And it became the quick recognition that my statistics, my research, my numbers, and I think so many of us live in the world of numbers and graphs and Excel spreadsheets, like every single one of those numbers was actually a kid. a kid I've probably seen in the last year. And like,
Wow.
I've examined them, I've touched their heads, I've given them high fives. Like I've looked in their noses and ears. And it was as if those kids like jumped out of my spreadsheets and lifted me up and gave me the courage to keep going. So it was this constant grounding in my why. Like, my why is my kids. Like, my children in Flint are my why. They are why I wake up in the morning. They are why I went to school forever. They are why I work long hours. And it was that why that allowed me to keep going, and to really silence those thoughts that that I wasn't good enough, and that maybe I was wrong, and that maybe I was causing this massive embarrassment or shame, or what in Arabic we call eb, to not only my family, but my profession and my hospital and university. Because once again, it wasn't about me, it was about others.
Oh, fascinating. I mean, the other thing I noticed in your book, you started off with, instead of starting, about Flint, Michigan, you actually talk about yourself. I'm an Iraqi, I'm an immigrant. So why did you feel it was important to start your book off in that way?
Thank you for asking that. So when I finally committed to writing a book, which was definitely not what I thought I was going to do when I started medical school, but then again, I never thought I'd be kind of in the middle of this public health crisis. And when I started to write a book, it was just going to be a Flint story. It was going to be about me, kind of a firsthand account in the middle of this most emblematic environmental and public health disaster. And that's what I started to write. And as I began to write that, it really became impossible to tell you that story without telling you who I was and who, and where I came from. So in a sense, it became also very much this immigrant story, about a little brown girl who came to this country when she was 4, fleeing a dictatorship, fleeing oppression, fleeing tyranny, coming to America for what most immigrants come here for freedom and opportunity and democracy and that American dream. And that was absolutely realized for me and my family. And that gave me this kind of perspective of how I see the world as somebody who's every day grateful to be in this country, but also somebody who has this, I say, like this heightened antenna for injustice, because my parents never shielded me from what people in power could do to vulnerable populations. And when I came to this country, Lady Liberty's arms were open a bit wider, and my diversity was celebrated, and I was allowed to kind of really grow up confident and competent, but also committed to service. So you kind of have to understand that perspective, the way I see the world, which helps you understand how I ended up going into medicine, into service, into practicing in a place like Flint.
Yeah, I mean, what an amazing just personal story, and how it sort of grounds you in the work that you've done. So what I also found that was striking about your book is the title. So can you tell us, how did you choose that title as well?
Yeah, so the title of the book is What the Eyes Don't See. And, writing a book was really hard. And I think picking the title was one of the hardest things. I had 8 pages of possible titles for this book. And, finally, I just really fell in love with What the Eyes Don't See. And it means many different things. It comes from a D.H. Lawrence quote that says, "The eyes don't see what the mind doesn't know." It's something that I first heard when I was a pediatric resident, when I was in my training. Whenever we were at the bedside, rounding with our team, taking care of critically ill patients, there was one supervising doctor who would always say, the eyes don't see what the mind doesn't know, whenever we were like stuck on a diagnosis or we hadn't read enough, pretty much telling us, you need to read more, because if you don't know what's out there, you're not going to be able to properly treat kind of the patients in front of you. But then, I love the title because it has many other meanings. So What the Eyes Don't See also refers to the quite literal. We don't see lead in water. So lead in water is clear, it's colorless, it's odorless, it's tasteless. You guys, like I said, probably remember seeing those pictures of Flint water, like those brown, yucky pictures. That was from iron corrosion that caused the rusty colored water. Lead in water, you don't see. We also don't see the consequences, the acute symptoms of lead exposure. I mentioned that earlier. We call this, it's ubiquitous, it's a silent, insidious epidemic. So we don't see lead poisoning right away. I wish we did, because then we'd kind of be able to identify it and prevent it. And then it means a lot more than that too. It means, most importantly, people and places and problems that we choose not to see.
Right.
So many folks close their eyes to Flint. That's those people over there. They don't look like me. I don't have to see what's happening over there. They close their eyes and they literally look the other way. It was a blindness. It was an indifference. So I think that's why I love this title the most. And really the take home of my story is that we all have the power to open our eyes. But it's not enough to be woke, to be awake. It's more important to take action, to do the right thing, even if it is the hard thing.
I mean, that really gives us context. I'm teaching this class called The Grand Challenges of Our Time. And part of it is about inspiring, passion for change. So I'm really quite interested, and I've just listened to your history and your background just a short time that we're with you. What inspires your passion to really inspire this kind of change?
Oh, I'm inspired by so many things, and most importantly, it is our children. They literally inspire me to keep going. Like I mentioned, when I was doubting myself, when I felt the power of the system who wanted to silence me, it was the kids who inspired me to keep going. And it is also our children that inspire me to work even harder for their promise. We talked about the toxicities that Flint kids face. And that's not unique to Flint. That is kind of throughout our country, where we have yet to see an America that truly values the promise of our children, where their trajectory is not bound by things like color of skin, state of birth, school district, zip code, drinking water source, country of origin, the list goes on. So it is that promise of our children that inspires me to keep going. As a pediatrician, I'm in the business of dreams. That's what I do. The business of our children's dreams. It is my job, very much to make sure the kid in front of me is healthy today, checking their heart and their lungs and doing all that fun stuff. But more importantly, my job is to make sure that they have the brightest future possible. It's so much of my job is like your job as educators. It's not so much about our kids today, but it's about what they will become, and making sure that their path is as unobstructed as possible for them to achieve their dreams.
So at this time, I'm going to thank you. That's really inspiring. I'm going to turn it over to Brian. I think he wants to get to some questions from the audience. And so Brian can come on.
All right, great. Thank you, Dr. Mona. That's really an amazing story, and how it parallels President Pine's Grand Challenges classes. It just makes you the perfect first featured guest for the Presidential Distinguished Forum series. I do want to open it up for questions. We have a lengthening list. For anybody who has a question for Dr. Mona, we encourage you to use the question and answer button at the bottom. Go ahead and click on that and type in your question, and we're going to get to as many as we can. Dr. Mona, I'm going to start with another fellow public health superstar here, Dr. Stephen Thomas. He writes, I read the news reports and stories about how the system came after you, tried to destroy your career. My students and I need to know the source of your strength. Did you call mentors? How did your peers treat you?
Oh, that's a great question. So I kind of had a village of support. My work is really only possible back then and now with layers and layers of support. So professionally, so from the chair of my department to other kind of pediatricians and other academics, but also I felt that village of support even by those who weren't even around me. For example, when the news became national news, the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, who I've never met before, called me and just said, "Are you okay? How are you doing?" So it was amazing. I literally was lifted up by so much love by folks that I didn't even know. I've also become, part of a growing community of whistleblowers. There's a lot of truth tellers out there, and our stories are similar. When you speak truth to power, there's often intimidation, there's often retaliation. It's a trauma to go through that. And, there's a growing network, there's more whistleblowers now than anybody, which is great. Lots of amazing folks speaking truth to power. Those other fellow whistleblowers kind of have also been at my side, just as I have been at their side. I also was surrounded by levels and layers of support in my personal life. So if you read my book, you also know that, my parents are really involved, and my husband was super supported, and other extended family. It's really hard for a woman with a career to balance a bazillion different things, and let alone uncover and try to help a city recover from a crisis. So we all need layers and layers of support, and the way that you can start building those layers of support for you is by building a network. So meeting people, making friends, going to random lectures like this, participating in class. Like, I leaned on old professors from college. I leaned on my high school mentor, my environmental group leader. I was able to, lean on so many folks that I never thought I'd lean on before throughout my career and my training. So take advantage of the incredible wealth of resources that you have at the university. Get engaged, be involved, say yes, take risks. You'll fail, that's okay. You'll learn how to get back up, and you'll hopefully get back up with somebody right next to you.
Great. Next question comes from Harper Davis. She writes, when do you feel your research was truly heard? Was it, for example, when the water source switched back?
That's a great question. When did I feel my research was truly heard? I think probably when the state validated it, when they agreed with my findings. So at first they were denying and dismissing it for quite some time, attacking me personally, attacking the science. And then, we fought back with more numbers, we fought back with more science, we fought back with teamwork. And at that point, there was also growing media attention. So journalists are your friend too. We need journalists to shine light on so many of these critical stories. And finally, the state conceded. They went back and looked at their numbers, because they actually had very similar numbers. Blood lead is part of surveillance programs, and then they publicly shared that hey, you were actually right, your science was right. So I think that's probably when I felt validated and that my research was acknowledged. Obviously, we also got our research eventually published in a peer-reviewed paper. It wasn't in the beginning. We shared our research very publicly at a press conference, which was like an academic no-no. It was a form of academic disobedience. I've gotten all these really humbling accolades through this process, but I think my favorite one was a disobedience award by MIT for not going through that academic peer review process, because that takes time. It takes months and months and months, and sometimes years, to get research published. And our research had to be shared right away at a press conference to protect children and their families. So when it was also finally published in a journal, I think that was also validating. But the research is ongoing, and there continue to be, assaults to that research. There continue to be folks who are lead deniers, and continue to be folks who are trying to minimize the crisis to date because of the extensive litigation.
All right, great. Next question comes from Sonia. Sonia writes, you're a teacher. What would you say is most important for health professional educators to teach their students about policy change to address health inequities?
That's a great question. So there is a lot that we need to be teaching our students in regards to addressing health inequities, and ultimately changing policies to address those health inequities. And if you've read my book, or if you heard me speak, and as we did kind of in the beginning, I started with history, right? I started with Flint's history, and we talked about kind of the history of manufacturing, but also the history that followed. And I think the most important thing that we could teach students of any discipline is history. We tend to be a really ahistoric nation. We have failed to learn our history. We literally step over history every day, but we do a really good job closing our eyes to any history that is dark or complicated. So if we especially want to address inequities, we have to start by looking back. And only when we look back can we really fully understand where we are. And then that finally enables us to figure out where we need to be. So the number one thing I could recommend is read history, learn history, take history classes, read literature. All those things give you a really well-rounded perspective. It's something that I've learned through this crisis is how important it is to work with folks who are so different than me in a very multidisciplinary way. My team that came together was an unexpected team. As we progress through our careers, we tend to get really hyper-specialized and we live in these silos, but we can't solve problems just with one profession. We need to engage with so many different folks to solve issues like inequities. We need to have economists and historians and public health experts and doctors and geographers and all these different folks at the table to address these, long-standing systemic issues.
Dr. Mona, I'm going to read a little section out of your book here, and it goes like this. This is also a story about the deeper crises we're facing right now in our country. A breakdown in democracy, the disintegration of critical infrastructure due to inequality and austerity, environmental injustice that disproportionately affects the poor and Black, the abandonment of civic responsibility and our deep obligations as human beings to care and provide for one another. Along with all that, which is a lot already, it's also about a bizarre disavowal of honesty, transparency, good government, and respect for scientific truth. You wrote this pre-COVID.
I know.
But this is a story. This is a story more. This is not just a story about Flint, Michigan.
Right.
Yeah, right. You're exactly, Brian. So, I people are like, did you anticipate we would be in this kind of pandemic when you wrote this book? I'm like, no, I had no idea that we'd be in the pandemic, but hey, it's the same lessons. There are exactly the same lessons that we learned in Flint that we are now experiencing as a nation. And that is why I wrote this book. And that's why I'm so excited to be here with you, is to share that these lessons are not isolated. The story of Flint's not isolated. This is not just about that one city over there that had the brown water, did a bad thing, and that person spoke up. No, this is about everywhere. This is about injustices everywhere. And most importantly, this is about our power to stand up to those injustices and to fight the status quo. And there's probably 4 big lessons that we learned in Flint. That we need good governance that values public health, that we need to respect science, that we need to preventatively and proactively invest in public health infrastructure. And we learned most strikingly about disparities and inequities. And for me, for so long, I've been trying to share these lessons. That's one of the reasons I wrote this book. And now the nation is experiencing with COVID the exact same lessons. We are learning that we need good governance that values public health. We are learning that we have to listen to scientists and doctors and experts. We are learning that we can't just react to public health crises, that we have to invest proactively to prevent crises and build the infrastructure to manage and minimize crises. And we are learning, like what most of us in public health already know, about the tremendous role of disparities and inequities, that no, this is not the great equalizer, that it continues to be people who are poor and predominantly minority of color that are burdened by such disasters. So I am an internal optimist. I am hopeful. I am so glad that the nation is now learning these very same lessons that Flint is learning, because that makes me excited that we will finally be able to take heed of these lessons and make sure that these kind of things don't happen again.
The next question is from Bill, and it sort of builds on that. He writes, You talked a bit about how you made your work more compelling by personalizing it. What other lessons have you learned about combating disinformation?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bill. And I think I've also learned to use a lot of other tools of communication. So I talked about kind of using the personal, and that was really important. That was important to kind of get media attention. It was also really important to persuade policymakers. You know, I sat in many offices in DC and our state capitol, and sometimes not until I kind of shared those stories, like we talked about, did we get folks to come to our side and to you know, to get involved and, you know, co-sponsor bills or what have you. But I've also learned that we need other tools of communication, especially in academics and science. You know, we are trained really well in academia to do a lot of scientific writing, to publish, for example, in journals that maybe like 5 people read, maybe a little more. So, you know, I've learned that we have to do a better job communicating with the lay public. And when I was writing my book, that was a decision I had to make. Like, who's my audience going to be? Like, I could have easily written like a science, public health, environmental book, but I'm like, no, I want to write something that everybody can read, and that folks in any discipline, like law or policy or, you know, science or whatever, anybody can take something away from it. And so, you know, I purposely wrote a book like that in a very kind of narrative literary way. You know, and my last kind of publication, you know, wasn't in the journal of whatever, but it was in the New York Times. You know, it was about like, how do we reimagine kind of our nation post-COVID? So we have to get trained early on, and we have to take advantage of opportunities that may come our way to be better communicators, especially of science and facts, especially in this era of disinformation. I blame a lot of kind of this state of science denial that we're in, be it climate change or COVID or vaccines or whatever. I put some blame on us as scientists, that we've never done a really good job being communicators, good communicators of that science. So I think there's more that we can do to improve upon that. Fortunately, you know, in my discipline in pediatrics and in my background, I had those opportunities. I mean, nothing to the extent of kind of being in the midst of this crisis, but like, for example, my first op-ed was in the Michigan Daily, our undergraduate newspaper. I was a freshman in college. I had just done an alternative spring break trip. I was so moved by it, by this whole concept of service learning, and the university, I think, was threatening to cut funding for it, and I got so upset. So I wrote an op-ed. I'd never written an op-ed before. I'm like, I'm going to write an op-ed, and I'm going to tell them that they should keep funding, you know, for these kind of really importance if we want to make sure we have future leaders who, you know, value, you know, service. So I took a risk in college because it was a safe place, just like so many of you are now in the safe place where you have advantage of all these different opportunities where you can do these kind of things.
Great. Next question from Paul. And I think this relates to the Flint Child and Development Fund. So hopefully you can tell us a little bit about that. But he writes, are you seeing that any nutritional educational programs aimed at children that were exposed in Flint are having positive outcomes to improve those with high lead levels? Yeah, that's a great question, Paul. And that's pretty much how I spend my everyday. So from the moment of really kind of recognizing the extent of our crisis, and it wasn't just a lead crisis, it was really a population level trauma, and just the feelings of being betrayed by government, the stress, the anxiety, the guilt, you know, all of these emotions can also lead to poor health outcomes. So we've kind of holistically built our response to address the entire trauma of the crisis, and also recognizing that it was on top of a lot of pre-existing trauma, right? Like we talked about the disparities. You know, we have a 70% child poverty rate in Flint. We have no grocery stores, you know, population loss. We talked about life expectancy. So this was a trauma on top of pre-existing trauma. So the things that we've been able to put into place are things that all kids need, but Flint kids didn't have it, and many kids didn't have it. There are things like nutrition resources and expanded WIC and nutrition prescriptions and breastfeeding support and education support with like home visiting programs and high quality childcare and early literacy, like books for little kids, and healthcare access and trauma-informed care and mental health services. So, you know, so much of the story of Flint is a story of
science denial, and then science spoke truth to power. And then we are absolutely leaning on the science of child development and early adversity and kind of resilience in our recovery. So what we are hoping to do is really kind of mitigate the consequences of this crisis, hoping not to see all those bad things that we talked about that led and trauma in general does. So we are trying to kind of in a very population way understand how folks are doing right now. We've built something called the Flint Registry. It's funded by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, to see how folks are doing, get them connected to all these awesome things. So it's actually a public health effort, and then to follow them over time. So to date, about 30,000 people have already started to sign up in the registry, which is amazing. About 15,000 referrals have been made for these like really critical services. And the early data that's coming out, does show concerns in our children in terms of cognition and behavior. We can't prove causation because it's really hard with environmental health stuff, but that's not our goal. Our goal is to see where folks are doing now and to get them into the supports that they need so that they can not only recover, but thrive. And one of the bright sides, if there is a bright side, is that, because of our last public health crisis, we built this public health infrastructure, like the registry, to support families. And then when we were hit with this public health crisis, the COVID pandemic, that same infrastructure, because we were preventative and proactive, was helping to connect families to the things they needed, like food, like healthcare access, like enrichments for their children. So, when you are preventative and proactive and put in that work, it definitely helps in the future.
Great. Next question from Debbie. How long did this process take? So one of the things that was in your book, Dr. Mona, was how long people actually kind of knew before action and until you came along and spurred action. And were there other pediatricians or doctors that worked with you?
Yeah, that's a great question, Debbie. So the water switch happened in April of 2014. And for a year and a half, there were problems and concerns and red flags. And once again, those were all being kind of dismissed and denied and reassured that nothing was okay. And I didn't get involved until like a year and a half, like from the onset. So I often say like, I was like the last domino, like so many folks were like, raising concerns, and moms and pastors and activists and journalists and water scientists, all these folks were saying that there was something wrong with the water, but nobody was listening to them. And then I came in and kind of provided the science that our children were in harm's way. And finally, the house of cards began to fall. But I want to bring home that I shouldn't have had to do any of what I did. Like, obviously our crisis never should have started, but it should have ended when that first mom held a jug of brown water. And that's why this case is such a story of environmental injustice. It's a story of, once again, people who are poor and predominantly minority, who were denied a seat at the table, denied their voice being heard. And they should have been heard. They absolutely should have been heard because they knew something was wrong. It shouldn't have taken that person with lots of degrees after her name to share that our kids were already being poisoned for something to happen. But the lesson also in this story is that when academia speaks up, change happens. Yeah. So know that you have power. You have power in your voice. You have power in your position. You have power in your expertise. So don't minimize the power that you have to get out of your ivory towers and get into the communities that we are privileged to work in to make a difference.
And actually, it plays right into the next question from Caitlin, who writes, students might not think it's their place to address critical issues like this, that it might not be part of being a scientist or an engineer or a researcher. What would you say to students?
Yes, it's your place. We need you. We absolutely need you. And, I think it's a little different in every kind of discipline. In my discipline in medicine and pediatrics, like my activism was expected. And, it was one of the reasons I went into this profession, like, because of that role of advocacy. Like, I wear lots of hats as a doctor. I'm a clinician, I'm a researcher, I'm an educator, but I'm also an activist. You know, it's always, I was trained, and it's something I train my students to do, is to use their voice to help elevate, you know, issues, and, you know, use their expertise to protect and, you know, and safeguard the health of their communities. So that was definitely part of kind of my discipline. My colleague in the story, and a water engineer, it wasn't that, you know, he didn't get that same kind of warmth from his professional community. And there was even an op-ed published in an engineering journal that said he crossed the imaginary line, that he should have stayed in his lab, that he never should have got out of his lab, he never should have driven to Flint, worked with the citizens to kind of to transparently show that there was lead in the water. And that's not how he sees the world, and that's not how I see the world. The purpose of science, you know, for me, is to benefit the public good. You know, it does very little for us and our communities if we don't share our expertise, once again, with the communities that we are privileged to serve. So yeah, we need to work in partnership, and I want to stress the partnership. We can't come down and say, hey, we're academia, we know everything, let us do it this way. You have to work in a very community participatory, humble, shoulder to way with communities.
Great. Next question from Ryan. This is a tough one, but a really great question. Do you think in a just world that someone would have been charged for doing the water switch or for trying to suppress your research?
Ryan, that is an awesome question. And people used to ask me about lawsuits and accountability and who should go to jail and investigations. And for a long time, I would deflect. I'm like, I'm not answering that. I'm a doctor. I'm not a lawyer. Ask the lawyers, ask the investigators, ask the attorney general, ask other folks who are working on those things. And then the more I continue to practice in Flint and to interact with the impacted community, the more that I realized that the concept of restorative justice is also part of health and healing. If you don't have justice, I think of it like a wound that won't close, that stays open, that gets reinfected, that is raw because justice has not been served. And that's the lesson for this story, but that's the lesson for so many injustices that have been perpetuated in our nation. We have to come to terms with that. We need to have this concept of restorative justice and accountability. So that was also probably one of the hardest parts about writing this book, is because there's not a the end to the story. And the biggest part of the lack of closure is this lack of justice. And for the people of Flint, this kind of justice delayed very much feels like justice denied. We just had a few weeks ago a settlement on the civil cases. It was a preliminary and a partial settlement with the largest defendant, which was the state of Michigan. They were the kind of the biggest culprits in the story. And it was a $600 million settlement that goes predominantly to the children. So it's a great first step. It also respects the science of what happened, where kind of most of that settlement goes to kids. However, the criminal cases are the accountability. The criminal cases are like, who's going to go to jail, you know? And that's still in process, and it's been years, and that has still been in process. I've also learned that justice is defined differently by different folks. You can ask 10 people what justice is, and you'll get 10 different answers. So some people want to see folks in jail. Some people want to see monetary damage. Some people want the long-term continuation of healthcare programs. Some people, you know, just want clean water. So just, can you imagine just having clean water? Like, that would be amazing. But that should be basic. So, you know, it's different for everybody, and that kind of diversity also needs to be understood. But once again, its justice is so important for healing and for recovery.
Kind of a related question, and for this question, I'm going to go to a student actually from President Pines' Grand Challenges class, and the question is this: what do you think can be done now to address systemic racism throughout healthcare?
Oh, that's an awesome question, and I am so reassured and heartwarmed by so much that is happening in so many different places to finally address systemic racism. Healthcare is a culprit, just like so many other systems. You know, the criminal justice system, the education system, but the healthcare system hasn't always been a good player, and it has had many incidences and historic practices of systemic racism. I teach my learners a lot of the history of that. We read, for example, about the Tuskegee experiments, where patients had syphilis and they were denied penicillin. We read about Henrietta Lacks, which happened in your neighborhood at Hopkins. The story of Henrietta Lacks, a great book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, where these cells were taken and patented and profits were made, but this person didn't know about it. There's so many stories of systemic racism throughout the history of medicine that we need to come to terms with. It's happening a little bit. For example, the American Academy of Pediatrics just apologized for some historic issues where they kind of didn't allow membership of 2 African-American pediatricians like decades ago. We're also seeing it with a lot of other kind of medical society. This is also a place where kind of leadership matters. So now we have a new governor in Michigan. She's declared racism as a public health crisis. Our chief medical doctor has just mandated implicit bias training and disparities training for all doctors in the state. That's awesome. That is amazing. There's so many of my doctor colleagues who've never heard of implicit bias. Like, it's something that I in public health I'm quite familiar with, but so many other doctors don't understand that folks get treated differently when they present to the ER, for treatment decisions, for diagnosis decisions. I mean, the list goes on and on of kind of biases and inequities. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen in many sectors, including in medicine. But I think it starts with good leadership. It starts with acknowledging the history, and also really coming up with a good anti-racist plan that we can all implement.
There were so many jaw-dropping sections in your book, but one of them was that during the height of this crisis, when the Flint residents had lead-tainted water, they were also paying the highest amounts for their water in the nation, I believe. So, but what is the Kelsey Challenger asked this great question, and maybe this is a more of an uplifting answer. What is the state of Flint today?
Oh, good question, and I'm glad you asked that. So, yes, Flint was a water affordability crisis before we were even a water quality crisis. There were many water shutoffs in Flint and in Detroit. So much so that the United Nations was involved because of the human right to water, which was denied in so many cities, which is so ironic and maddening, because once again, we are surrounded by the largest source of fresh water in the world. Yet we continue to deprave our most poor and vulnerable residents with fresh water for medical, public health purposes, hygiene, hand washing, pandemic prevention, the list goes on. So it was definitely an affordability crisis, and that was in place because of kind of this near bankrupt state. They were using the revenue from the water bills to kind of cover all the other costs, but totally unjust, and especially for water that they couldn't drink. So where are we now? We still have affordability issues that hasn't been completely addressed. There's still some legacy water shutoffs, which finally are getting back on because of the pandemic. Because of the pandemic, our governor issued an executive order, like many governors, to halt water shutoffs and to restore legacy shutoffs. But it's not just like a simple switch to flip of a button. They often needs plumbers and lots of work to get that back up and operational and safe. So we still have water affordability issues. We're trying to turn back water on for people who had them shut off because of non-payment. But our water quality has absolutely improved. So after we went public, got the state to concede, we switched our water source back to the Great Lakes, which was awesome. But the 18 months that we were on this really bad corrosive water, ate up our pipes. And the folks at the EPA said it was like drinking through a lead painted straw. And we never knew when a piece of kind of corroded lead scale was going to come off those pipes and into our drinking water. So those pipes are being replaced and we're almost done. So 2020, the pipe replacement will be complete, which is amazing. We'll only be the third city in the country that has replaced their lead pipes. But many, many cities are following post Flint. But because we are doing this kind of unprecedented citywide infrastructure work, it has the potential to release more lead from the pipes. Whenever you move the earth, you have the potential to disrupt the lead scale and increase lead release. So because of the infrastructure work, we are still on the precautions to use filtered water and bottled water. But that's almost done. It's also really the fastest it's ever been done in any city. So it's for a good reason, but the precautions are still in place for the water. And there are ongoing efforts as well to address the affordability issues.
Great. I think we have time for maybe two more. And the next one, we're going to go to our Dushanka Kleiman, who is actually an associate dean in our School of Public Health. And she writes this: Dr. Mona, we used your book 2 years ago as the first year book for our inaugural master's degree class. Your personal story really resonated with students, faculty, and staff, and we would love to continue learning from your work. Given your experience, what would you like to see added to public health curricula to prepare the next generation of health practitioners?
Thank you for that question. And I remember when you guys used my book, it was super exciting. And you know, like Brian mentioned earlier, it's obviously still a really kind of relevant story, especially kind of in this current state of public health crisis. So I think if I were going to like include something in a curricula, not just of public health students, but all students, it's something that I touched on before, and that is kind of better communication skills. You know, be it, you know, I stayed another year in college to take creative writing classes. And like, thank God I did this, because I didn't know I was going to write a book, but like, yay, I was able to kind of write in different media, more public speaking opportunities, social media training, branding, messaging, like all these different things are really important. And it's not something that we get in public health training or medical training, or, you know, it depends, you can seek it out. So, you know, especially in this moment that we're in, where this trying to combat so much misinformation and disinformation, and where science is really under assault, and scientists are under attack. You know, whatever we can do to add more skills and tools for future practitioners, I think that would be really important. Another thing that I think is probably already included in public health curricula is anything in regards to kind of wellness and kind of burnout. And you know, that's a big issue in medicine, as I think it's a big issue in many disciplines. It's hard not to feel overwhelmed, especially if you turn on the news and kind of, you know, look at what's happening in the world. And that's totally understandable. I think we really need to allow folks to know that it's okay not to be okay, and that, you know, we have resources, and there's things that folks can do to you know, to lean on others and to get the support that they need when they're not doing well.
Yeah. President Pines, I'm actually going to come back to you for this last question, and this will be the last one, and then we can wrap up. In her book, Dr. Mona writes, "The world shouldn't be comprised of people in boxes minding their own business. It should be full of people raising their voices, using their power and presence, standing up for what's right." Isn't that sort of what you believe in, and that's why we're doing the Grand Challenges course?
Absolutely. This is what it's all about. Today, we've had a chance to listen to Dr. Mona. And if you're not inspired by her sharing her story with you on how a single human being, Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, can actually be inspired about a problem in a city called Flint, Michigan, and make a difference for the people of Flint, but not just the people of Flint, for people of the entire United States, to raise the visibility of something so important, and that is the health and safety of our children, who are our future. So if you're not inspired by her story to tackle a social, environmental, justice problem, such as lead in water, I don't know what else you can be inspired by. You know, Dr. Hanna-Attisha, you are someone special. You are an
Oh,
amazing
thank you.
person. I'm so delighted that you are literally our first speaker in this inaugural course on Grand Challenges. You have inspired me. I just sit here quietly, listening to how you answer these questions, and just your own personal story and how it really reflects positively on what we all should be doing along these public health crises. So I think it informs what we should do even now. So we're grateful to have you. And I say to our students and our entire community, this is what it's all about. Really take on challenges that you really care about and you're passionate about, and inspires you to do good work on behalf of humanity in a positive way.
Oh, thank you. Can I just end with one quote?
Absolutely.
So this is a quote from one of my favorite doctors who said, "Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not." So that's Dr. Seuss from the Lorax. So I think that kind of really sums up what I believe in and what President Pines just articulated. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mona, for first of all, sharing your just personal story and this incredible story about Flint, Michigan. And I would say more importantly, thank you for being a role model to so many, to women scientists, women clinicians, women researchers, to people in general, to immigrants. Your story is so compelling, and we're just grateful to have had you. I also want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who joined us today and ask those really incredible questions that show that you were truly engaged with this incredible story. So I thank you, and I thank the entire University of Maryland community. And we will have another one of these coming up shortly. So now I'm going to turn the mic back to Brian, who will close out this session.
All right, thank you. Thank you, President Pines and Dr. Mona. I echo President Pines' appreciation for you joining us and being our inaugural speaker here. This Distinguished Presidential Forum was sponsored by Gemstone Honors Program, the Honors Humanities, University Honors, the Do Good Institute, University Libraries and Leadership and Community Service Learning, and Voices of Social Change. That just gives you a sense of how many people really wanted to make this happen today, Dr. Mona, so really appreciate it. And again, our next forum will be October 14th. Mark that on your calendars. We hope all of you will join us again. And again, thank you to President Pines, and thank you, Dr. Mona. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everybody. Good night.
Thank you. Stay safe. Wear a
Thank you,
mask.
Dr. Mona.
Get your
Take
flu
care.
shot. Okay.
Bye.